There we go.
Good
Good morning, Ray.
morning, Don.
Okay, let's start the interview, and we'll start using our regular process here. I'll introduce myself and then kind of hand it over to you. All right?
Okay.
Okay. My name is Don Obrist. You spell that last name Obrist, and I am an interviewer for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today's date is August 26, 2020. And today I'm going to be discussing the military experiences with Ray Eberling. And Ray happens to also be an interviewer with the Veterans History Project at the University of Florida. So Ray, good morning, and hand it over to you for a minute or two here. Could you state your name, spell your last name, your date of birth, and where you were born?
Yes. My full name is Raymond Albert Eberling. That last name is B as in Bravo, Erling, Eberling. I was born May 10th, 1948 in Suffern, New York. That's in Rockland County, right down on the New Jersey line. Yes.
Okay. How many years did you live in Suffern? Is that where you were brought up?
That was just the hospital. I lived in the county seat of Rockland County, a little unincorporated hamlet called New City, which just happened to be in the geographic center of the county. But some more familiar towns in that part of New York State, right by the Hudson River, Nyack, for instance.
Okay.
Right off the bridge, yes.
What was it like growing up in that area of New York State in the 50s?
Well, to me, the 50s was a golden era. I was in the fifth generation of my family in that town, and our family, with a few others, had up to that point had almost kind of written the history. But like every other place, especially when you're 30 miles from New York City, after World War II, it started growing. Yeah, with housing developments, the GI Bill, all the housing boom that was going on. In the mid 50s, they put the New York Thruway and the Garden State Parkway right through that area, and they built what was then known as the Tappan Zee Bridge, and which most of the locals still like to call the Tappan Zee Bridge. And so from the early 50s, when I started kindergarten, in a decade, we had become a big bedroom community. So I saw that from the time I was, basically a toddler up through the time of high school. The town had really changed, in those 10 years.
But a lot of that probably had to do with the thruway being put in and the bridge and the infrastructure changing. It brought a lot of people out of the New York City area.
Right. If you think of, the post-war, and you think of Levittown, Long Island, and places like that, a lot of that had to do with, the GI Bill and the no money down VA loans that you could get. And you had all these young families and a housing shortage. So, we were 30 miles from Midtown Manhattan, and it was inevitable.
Right, right. Did you get into New York City much as you were growing up?
Sometimes. My father had gone to school there, and in his early years had been a banker there. And my mother had worked there when they met. But it was a special occasion to go down to New York City. We would go to Radio City, perhaps, or it was like a family outing.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's start with your dad. What did he do? And did he work in that area, or did he work in the city?
He initially worked in the city. He graduated from high school in '33, but had a New York State Regents scholarship, and he got to go to NYU, during the Depression. And he came out of there and worked for a bank in New York City for a while. But long term, when I was growing up, he worked for a big pharmaceutical company right near us up there in Rockland County, Letterly Laboratories, which has been since bought out by Pfizer. But, he put on a suit and a fedora every day and grabbed his briefcase and went to Letterly Laboratories and did something there. I think he was an accountant or that sort of thing. He was not a scientist.
Well, that was not, I wouldn't want to say unusual, but it was not common for him to have the opportunity to go to college, particularly during that period of time.
Yes, he was fortunate. Like I say, his father was a mailman, so he never lost his job. And in fact, retired about the time he graduated from high school. He got to retire early, and so they had job security through all that. And like I say, I don't know what NYU cost back in those days, but I think it was competitive enough where he went there on like I say, on a New York State Regent scholarship.
Sure. Okay, now what about your mom?
Um, she was she grew up in the neighboring town. Uh, Spring Valley was the name of the town. Graduated from the neighboring high school. A year younger than my father. Uh, Back then, not as many women were going to college. But again, her father worked in a bank that never closed in New York City. He never lost his job. So, but her career path at that time was to, she went to like a post-high school secretarial course, and she wound up working at the corporate headquarters of Lord and Taylor in New York City. And my parents actually met on the commuter train, you know, sometime in the late 30s.
Okay, okay. How about brothers and sisters?
I've got one older sister, Bonnie, who is 7 years older than me, although went to school early, so she was 8 years ahead. Married her childhood sweetheart, Young, who happened to be in the army in Germany at the time. And, you know, she was like a year out of high school and moved to Germany to be with her husband. And then I have a brother 2 years older than me, who for many years was a film and video producer and taught film and video production down at Palm Beach State College, down in the West Palm Beach area. He did not serve in the service. However, he had a contract in the early 90s, the Armed Forces Radio and Television System, to do all these documentaries on the 25th anniversary, I think it was, of the end of World War II. I have to think of the numbers in my head, but yeah. And he is now retired. That's all my siblings.
Okay. Now you said fifth generation. The Eberlings were fifth generation. Is that right?
In that little town of New City, New York, yes.
Have you done some research on that? That's a lot of generations.
I've done a lot of research on it. That's one of my retirement hobbies is, you know,
Okay.
family history. I do work with town and county history up there in Rockland County, although I haven't lived there since 1964. And yeah, so I do absorb myself and that getting ahead of the game. But when I was stationed in Germany in the service, I actually found the relatives over there that were like seventh cousins or something, and we became friends.
Is that right? Are you in contact with them at all now, or just that when you're
It's
there?
lapsed. We know how to reach each other, but we had a good
Sure.
time. I mean, I visited them. You know, they were into it too, and they got us back to like the 1600s as far as family tree. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're very good administratively with a lot of detail, a lot of documents, right?
Yeah.
So it sounds like you had a very 1950-ish kind of childhood upbringing. Seems to have been happy. We're secure.
Very, very much so. Very much so. Ideal times. Like I say, the town changed a lot, but we were getting new kids in from the city all the time in school. But you know, we became friends. Uh, all of that lasted till I was about halfway through 10th grade, and our parents, we knew this was coming, decided to move to Florida. So I finished high school in Florida, although my brother finished in New York. So, you know, that was a change. The odd thing was we were what was called snowbirds back then. On several winters, we went down to West Palm Beach, and my brother and sister and I would be enrolled in school down there for the winter, and then come back the spring to our original classes, and we grew up that way. So in 10th grade, when I went down there full time, I actually already knew some kids at my new high school.
Your dad was retired at that point? He must have been.
No, they had been wanting to move for some time. I don't think they liked all the suburban influx and were looking for something different.
Well, I mean, when you were going down to Snowbirds and then you come back.
Oh, I see what you're saying. He would come down on vacation, but it was like my mother would take the kids and I down, and her parents had retired there. So it was sort of like he stayed behind with the income, and uh, until we moved down full time. And then he was able to transfer. He got another accounting job at Pratt & Whitney Aircraft in West Palm Beach, which was a big defense contractor at the time and part of the space program. Yeah.
Were you happy about that, about the move down, the permanent move?
I'm probably ambivalent about it to this day. The good news is I really enjoyed my new high school. It was right at the beginning of the surfing craze. And I had a great time. I mean, the high school was like a mile from the beach. Made new friends, still have those. Thanks to social media and reunions, I'm as close, if not closer, to my New York friends from childhood than I was then. So, you know, it all worked out. I've got the best of both worlds, but certainly the move was an ambivalent one for me.
Right, right. So you graduated from high school in, let's say, 1966. Am I right on that?
That's correct.
In your last 2 or 3 years in Florida?
Half of 10th grade, 2.5 years.
2.5 years?
Yeah,
Okay.
the Florida high school.
So where did you go to college?
I went the first 2 years to the community college down there called Palm Beach Junior College. At the time, all my friends were going away to these fancy schools, and I was a little disappointed, but my parents had 2 sons to put through college at the same time. And you know, it was $50 a semester to go there at the time. At the time, it was called Palm Beach Junior College. It is now Palm Beach State College. And in retrospect, and I was just telling somebody about this, I probably would not have changed that experience, you know, for a full ride at an Ivy League school. And that sounds like hyperbole, but I had some very good experiences at that college. I had a very unusual opportunity to work in a television station in the news department when I was 19, 20 years old. You know, I was hired basically to be a gopher, but there was a news anchor that kind of, you know, I said I was interested in the business, and he mentored me. So, you know, by the end of the year, I was writing news copy. I was going out on stories. And it was just a very unique experience. And I'll add to that, I had some great professors at modest Palm Beach Junior College as well. So I appreciated it.
Did you pursue that academically at all? Broadcasting, or was it
that's one of those
field?
things in retrospect I wish I had done. I transferred to the University of Florida in the fall of '68 as a junior. I just walked into Channel 5 there at the university and said, hey, I used to work at Channel 12 in the news department. Can I work here? And they said, well, to be part of the news department, you have to be, you know, a broadcasting major. You have to be taking the course. But if you want to work in the studio, you can work in the studio. So the whole time I was at the University of Florida, to me, I had the best part-time student job at the university. And that was, you know, as a TV cameraman and a floor director for 2.5 years. So, yeah,
Okay.
but I you know, it's one of those roads not taken. I could have done that, but I didn't.
Okay. Okay. What was your major?
I originally started majoring in sociology. I switched over to the College of Education. I was a secondary social studies education major. That's what my bachelor's degree I got in 1970 consisted of, yes.
From the University of Florida.
From the University of Florida.
Well, that was interesting times in Gainesville, wasn't it?
Yeah. When I first got there in the fall of '68, some of my friends, I had some high school friends already there. They had all these student movements going on at the time, including the anti-war movement, some of the civil rights movement, some of it just, you know, change, unquote. And University of Florida was a very interesting place at the time because, you know, to break it down simply, you know, a big chunk of the population was in these protest movements, and the other chunk was still this very traditional Southern fraternity type atmosphere. I really didn't feel comfortable in either camp. I was somewhere in this gray area in the middle, and that's where I stayed the whole time I was here.
So you graduated in 1970, and
Yes.
did you go in the military right from then? From there?
Well, here's the thing, I first of all, I graduated in December. It took me a little longer. I went to summer school and I had a couple more courses to graduate. So it was December 1970. But I should backtrack and say, you know, as a historical footnote, which I know you're aware of, when you were in college back then, if you got to go to college back then, it was quite fortunate because they had this thing called a student draft deferment,
Correct.
category 2S.
Yeah, right.
College back then was a lot more traditional. You're pretty much either a full-time student or you weren't. And if you weren't a full-time student or had some other type of deferment, you were probably going to get drafted as a male. Backtracking to high school for a second, in our senior year, they took all the senior guys into an assembly. We had an assembly, and all the service recruiters were there and gave their pitch for like an hour. And they basically, the attitude was, okay, it's going to be one of us, here's what we have to offer. And that was it. But again, at the time I had the deferment for junior college. And then when I got to the University of Florida, again, there was some ambivalence there about, I thought at that point that the war was not a good idea, but I was never anti-military. Again, if I knew I was going to eventually make the Air Force a career, it would have made sense for me to go to ROTC from the very outset, but I didn't, So, but I had that student deferment. I should say that on December 1st, 1969, they changed from a deferment system to the draft lottery. And
right. You were in that first lottery because you were within that age grouping.
Yes.
Yes.
And so my birthday, May 10th, I was number 65. I tell people in classes that I've taught, I said, if you're my age and a male, chances are you know what your draft lottery number was. It's never left you.
Okay, it never left me. Mine was 117. You never forget it. And they drafted up to 195 that year.
Yeah. So we know these things in our head. Yeah.
Yeah. So were you thinking, you mentioned Air Force. I know that ended up being your career, but were you thinking Air Force then?
I think in the back of my mind, I always was. I have some people, uncles that were in aviation, and my grandfather was in aviation as a hobbyist when he retired. So I was kind of always brought up, I loved airplanes. If you're familiar with the Civil Air Patrol, I was a Civil Air Patrol cadet, both in Florida and New York. Although as I got into high school in Florida, I kind of dropped out of it. Too many other things going on. But I always knew if I was going to go in the service at some point, for some reason, Air Force was certainly going to be the first thing. My father had been in the Navy in World War II. My uncles had been in the Navy. Brother-in-law in the Army, but neither of those really appealed to me. In I just always felt comfortable with the Air Force from the time I was like a kid. Yeah.
Right. Now I see you did not actually enter the military till February of 74.
Right.
So that period between 1970 when you graduated to 1974, what were you up to?
Well, when I got that draft number, and they were going to let me finish the school year. The draft was I think they had a provision where if you're in your last year of college, they'd let you finish that year and then see what's happening the following year. So I went to Jacksonville. I was in school here for the summer. I went to Jacksonville in I think it was the summer of 1970, and took my draft physical. And I'm thinking, I think I made a phone call over to the Florida Air National Guard to see if they had anything going on. But I failed the draft physical unexpectedly. I had some minor heart condition. They said, well, it's nothing major, but we're going to defer you for another year. If, I had to have my heart checked every day for a week and have the results sent to the draft board. And they said, well, we're gonna have another physical for you in a year. So that didn't happen. I finished up my school year. I tried to get a teaching job in Palm Beach County. The whole school system in Florida in that fall of January 71, was going through a lot of controversy and things going on because of court-ordered mandates to better integrate the schools than the state of Florida had been trying since 1954, which was pretty much token integration. So suddenly there's these federal mandates from the courts, and there were very strict quotas on fact, not only to have a balance, every school had to be balanced racially, but so did the faculties. And I was in the most popular subject area at the time, social studies. I simply couldn't get a job except a substitute. So, but I tried for 3 years, finally gave up, and I had a cousin gone in the Air Force after not liking teaching, and he loved it. He became an officer. He just loved it. And one day I just walked in and talked to a recruiter, and I said, "What do you got for me?" And I signed up, and that was in fall of 1973.
So let me get this straight. Because of the physical condition that you had to submit, at least for a year, about your physical condition, did it inevitably end up that you weren't draftable?
That was only delayed for a year, but in fact, I was just looking up the numbers here because I couldn't remember. I knew I went back for a second physical down in Miami at this point, the summer of '71, and I passed it. And but at that time, I think they were only drafting people. They had a lottery every year, as it turns out, and I think they were only drafting for the year 1951 by then, because the Nixon was trying to pull the American troops out of Vietnam at the time and go to Vietnamization. So, I still could have been drafted, but I was so low on a priority list at that point. If you look at the statistics, every year from 1969, 70, 71, 72, whatever, the draft numbers went down until finally the draft went away in 1973.
Did you feel comfortable with that status?
What, that 1 year deferment, or the?
Well, the fact that were you still 1A? Did they reclassify?
I went back to 1A after a year. I'd actually, when that happened, because I had this renewed interest in, maybe the Florida Air National Guard will have something. When I failed it, I was suddenly kind of sort of disappointed, because again, I was never anti-military. And I sort of well, this is almost like a rite of passage I'm missing. So, yeah, I don't know what to say beyond that.
So you could have been drafted in the interim up till '74, but probably wasn't likely. You knew that.
Well, I forget the exact date, but the draft actually went away in 1973. Okay. But yes, up until that point, I could have been drafted, yes.
Okay. So you finally, let's see, you did get into the military. You were sworn in December of 1973.
Yes, it was a delayed enlistment.
And that was the Air Force, not was it the Guard?
No, it was the active duty Air Force. That Guard thing was just a thing in passing, a phone call or two I made to see what they might have over there in Jacksonville.
Right.
That never amounted to anything, actually.
So you actually decided were you deciding on a career in the Air Force at that point, or just
not at that time? I'll tell you what, I had given up on trying to find a teaching job. Sure. And here I was, almost 3 years out of college, living with my parents, and getting like a minimum wage construction job down there in Palm Beach County. And I was just thinking one day, I said, there's got to be something better than this. 3 years out of college, I'm supposed to be doing something productive at this point. And I thought back to my cousin who had gone into the Air Force after several years out of college. He loved it. He made it a career. And I literally, after one day on a construction site, just walked into the Air Force recruiter's office and started talking to him. And here was the deal. They said, yes, we can get you a commission, but we don't know when we can, because they're actually starting to what they call RIF people now, a reduction in force. They had too many people by then. Said, but what we can do is you qualify on all the officer tests. We can put you in for that. But in the meantime, I've decided I'm unemployed. I'm just doing nothing. And this was unusual, but I said, well, can I just go unenlisted for the time being until I can get an officer class date? And the guy said, sure. This guy was going to get, credit for both an officer and enlisted recruit from one person. He loved the idea. I did well on the Air Force officer qualifying test, I think they called it. Scored very high in navigation. I did okay in pilot, so they just weren't hiring pilots. So I was actually told that at some point I would get an officer training school date and a navigational school slot. They just didn't know when. They thought it might be a year away or something. So I went and enlisted. And at the age of 25, with a college degree, I was going through basic training with all these 18, 19-year-olds, which was interesting.
So you took a bit of a risk there because there's no guarantees, certainly.
Yeah. But at the time, young and single, didn't have anything else going on. To me, it was a lark. Believe it or not, I said, if I don't like this and they keep me enlisted for 4 years, I'll leave.
Okay. So you went through basic training, you got through that.
Yes.
And what was your first assignment?
Well, I went in under an open career field, they call it. In other words, it was undecided what I would do as an enlisted person, even though I actually had paperwork that says we'll send you to officer training school and, navigation training when we have class dates. And the actual people in the Air Force would be confused when I'd tell them that. They said, you did what? So they selected for me that I would go to become what's called a weather observer, which is kind of like an entry-level enlisted position to work at the weather shops, one of the weather shops in the Air Force. You went from observer, you went to forecaster, and I knew that the prospect was there. And for some reason, the commission navigation thing didn't work out. They still had a program where they would send people to get a master's degree in meteorology and get a commission that way. So I thought, well, that's kind of nice. So after basic training in April 1974, they sent me up to a technical training school, Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois, just north of Champaign-Urbana. And I went to weather observer school for like 6 weeks, and my orders for OTS, officer training school, came in the meantime.
Okay. Would you have been pleased if your career had changed to weather instead of navigation?
This sounds funny, but at the time, it may have been mildly disappointed, but every single day to me was a new experience. I was really enjoying it. I was pleasantly surprised at, for instance, our we call them training instructors, the drill sergeants in basic. They kind of gave you a hard time, but it was nothing like you saw in the movies. And I'd gone through the Civil Air Patrol encampment, they called it, at Griffiths Air Force Base in New York when I was a 15-year-old. And to me, that was harder than what I was going through in basic training. And the training instructor, when he found out, I was 25 and had a degree, while other guys were scrubbing toilets and buffing the floors, he had me in his office typing up reports. So it all worked out.
Sure.
So yeah, to me, I was sort of like on an adventure because I had absolutely nothing going on. 4 years of college, I thought I'd be a teacher, and that didn't happen. So yeah, I would have been mildly disappointed because I liked, the officer thing and getting wings and being in airplanes. But I could have lived with the other solution.
Okay, so great experience. And then you got your orders for navigation school?
The first, they were kind of like joint happening. While I was at Chanute as an airman basic, I got my orders for officer training school, which was going to start in June of '74. And from there in the fall, I would go to what they called undergraduate navigation training out in California, Sacramento, California. So they were kind of like, they had class dates for both. So I love
Obviously, obviously they didn't overlap your dates.
no. I think they were
Oh.
coordinated
Okay,
because
okay.
you know, I had to get commissioned first, so otherwise they couldn't send me out to UNT, we call it
So
undergraduate.
so you did the OTS first.
Yes, that was 12 weeks
Okay,
back in the same base where I'd gone through basic training. It was just like on an annex of that base, Lackland Air Force Base, Texas.
but how was that?
What's that?
How was that? How was OTS?
Well, you know, up until this time, I had really I was pleasantly surprised at how professional things were, how the Air Force, although yes, it was military, it was nothing like the stereotypes you saw in the movies at all. I thought the caliber of instructors were outstanding, and the same thing for OTS. Again, I went there in June of '74. It was a 12-week program. You went through fourth class, third class, second class, first class, and got increasing responsibilities as you were there. And sometime prior to that, I don't know when, they had gone co-ed in the training, so I didn't mind that. Again, I had a great time there. You know, you get in shape, you had to run a mile and a half every day. I jokingly said, and I mean this with respect, actually, it was almost like a finishing school in some ways. I mean, they actually had classes on how to select a wine and which fork to use, because you were going to be an officer, not an enlisted guy, you know. But they had the serious stuff too. I have a very good leadership. What they did is, you were followers for like the first 6 weeks. It was fourth class, third class. And then by second class, your last 6 weeks, beginning of 6 weeks, you got to be an assistant in charge of something. And then when you're first class, you were in charge of that thing. So, and then they had these bogus ranks. I wound up being an OT major, officer trainee major.
Okay, okay. So you found that interesting and challenging, then you go from there to
Yep.
navigation school. How long
Yes.
did navigation, how long was that?
That was officially going to be from like September till June, 74, 75. As we're getting close to our graduation date, they had such a backlog in the school that you went to after that, you know, the actual type of aircraft you'd be flying in, that they had to delay us like 3 months. So, you know, getting back to the beginning of the school, it was challenging to me at first. I eventually caught on and did well after a while, but for a while there, I thought I was going to have to drop out or something, or they'd throw me out. But I wound up doing well at the end. But June comes along, and several of the classes had to stick around all summer in what we call a casual status until our classes opened up in the fall for the type of aircraft we were going to. So, you know, they tried to give us these what they call professional military education courses, where we had to go in and these leadership courses. That lasted a while, but basically this was in Sacramento, California. You know, a couple hours in one direction was San Francisco, a couple hours in the other direction was Lake Tahoe. You know, so and Sacramento itself was a great town. So, you know, we really didn't mind.
Right, right, for those 3 months.
For those 3 months, and I should say beforehand, again, I was very, like officer training school, I was very impressed with the instructors. Most of them had just come back from Vietnam, you know, not too long ago. They knew their stuff. And we had classroom academics. And then once or twice a week, we had to fly. And then we'd be critiqued. Like I say, I struggled at first, but I eventually caught on and did fine. But I had a great time. I'm like a cheerleader for being surprised. The people I met, both my colleagues and the instructors, I really enjoyed it.
Right, right. So actually the navigation school was about 9 months?
Officially,
Yeah.
but like I say, a couple months hanging out. Yeah.
Couple months hanging out. Okay.
Yeah, and then we got our wings. You know, we get our wings.
Well, what aircraft? What was your specialty?
Well, that was the thing. We could put in what we called a dream sheet, which was, what do you want to fly? And a lot of guys put the F4s. They had navigators in the back seat of the F4 fighters. That was the hot shot assignment. Nobody seemed to want a B-52 at the time. I wanted a C-41 or a C-5, the cargo planes of the day. But much to my chagrin, I was given a tanker, Strategic Air Command, a KC-135 aerial refueling tanker, where we fueled other aircraft in the air. And not only did they give me a tanker, which I hadn't asked for, but they had assigned me to Wichita, Kansas, a base in Wichita, Kansas. And the first thing on my mind was, I didn't join the Air Force to live in Kansas. Nothing against anybody from Kansas. But they also had a system where if somebody in your class mutually wanted to swap an assignment in the same type aircraft, they would do it. And there was a guy in my class from Kansas wanted to go there. And his assignment was to Loring Air Force Base in Maine. And I'm thinking, oh, Maine, I love New England. I used to go to New Hampshire all the time. That's right next door. What I didn't appreciate at the time was Loring Air Force Base, Maine, was in the very tippy top of Maine, where it's like winter 8 months a year. But anyway, I swapped with him. People said I was crazy. But I did get the Loring assignment. And we finally, in September, I got to go down to Castle Air Force Base in California, Central Valley of California, for the Strategic Air Command School, where they taught, where you learned to, be on either a bomber or a tanker crew. And I was in the tanker program, of course. And Castle Air Force Base near Merced, California. And that was a 3-month course in the fall of '75.
And did you go back to Maine after that?
Yes. The 3 months at Castle and Tanker School was interesting. Again, we had like 3 weeks of classroom time, and then they put us on student crews. And for the remainder of that 3 months, I had a one-on-one instructor for all the sorties, the flights we had to go on. That was it, one-on-one, personal instructor. And you would plan the day before, you would fly the day, and then you would, critique the third day, and then the cycle would start all over again.
So what was it like flying? It was, okay, was it a refueling plane or was it a cargo plane? The refueling,
This was
right?
an air refueling plane, a KC-135
Okay.
it's called. It's sort of the military version, actually came out first of an old Boeing 707. We've had them since 1955. They're still flying. New wings, new engines, but the glass cockpit now, all glass panel cockpit when we used to have the old instruments, but they're still flying.
What did you refuel? What kind of planes?
At the school, I think it was almost entirely the B-52 students that we would refuel. My first assignment up in Maine, it was usually that. However, because we're on the East Coast, at that point, we had these things, we call them fighter drags informally. Whenever fighters had to go from the US to Europe on their regular rotations to European bases, a fighter can only fly for like an hour before it needs gas. So we had all these things where we would, you'd get a bunch of tankers with the fighters, and we'd take them to 30 West longitude, where a bunch of tankers from Mildenhall, England, would rendezvous with us, pick up those fighters and take them to Europe. So we did a lot of those, what we call fighter drags.
So explain to me the main, okay, I'm completely naive about this. I have no experience whatsoever, okay?
Yeah.
It would seem to me your responsibility, not only to get your plane from point A and back to point A, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But from point A to point B where you actually refuel.
Yes, one of the major responsibilities of the navigator at that time, because this is all pre-GPS, of course, was we ran the rendezvous with the receiving aircraft, or we ran the rendezvous with the tankers we were meeting up with out over the middle of the ocean. And so we had to learn how to run rendezvous. You think you're out in the middle of the ocean, you have to find these guys, and suddenly they have to be parked behind you to do the refueling. So that was interesting to learn. Again, pre-GPS, we didn't use inertial systems either at the time, which we eventually got, which is like the guidance systems they use in missiles. So once we were out of contact with any radio signals from land, we navigated to these other continents via celestial navigation, just like the old Navy ships did. We had a sextant, and we shot the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, and we navigated that way across the ocean.
Now, where you would rendezvous, let's say with these fighter jets, was
Yes.
that all predetermined? Was that on a plan that you had?
Yeah, there were planners usually at a headquarters level that would have all this planned. You know, when and where you're going to meet. They had to get the what we call an altitude reservation with the various air traffic controllers, that you had this block of airspace that was yours for a period of time, that sort of thing. Later on, I'm getting ahead of myself. I actually became one of those planners, like during Desert Storm. Yeah, much later on.
Okay. Sounds very complicated to me. I'm sure once you learn the process, it all makes sense and it works.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because one of my struggles in initially trying to learn this stuff was I considered myself a liberal arts kind of guy. You know, it was history, literature, music.
Sure.
And this was all very different. And it was like I had to restructure my brain. But once I caught on, I loved it. Because, there was almost like a Zen feeling to it to do all this stuff.
Right. Left brain, right brain kind of thing,
Yeah,
right?
it's like you had to train that other dormant side, which was a struggle at first.
You got to exercise that other side. That's right.
It's like somebody explaining a joke to you. You finally get the joke and you go, oh, and you think it's the funniest joke in the world. Well, that's what it was like.
Yeah. That's great. Great analogy. So how long were you in Maine?
I was at Loring Air Force Base from 1976 January to November 1979. I should say that when I was back at Castleton, California, I had a whirlwind romance and married the lady in Maine. So I was a newlywed while I was there in Maine. And then in 1979, my long-term plan was not to have an Air Force career, but also the short-term plan was to get out of northern Maine. It's the most beautiful place in the world on the right summer day, but most of the time it's overcast and a lot of snow and black flies in the summer and all that. So, so I had a minimum flying commitment from getting your wings. You had, I think, 5 years after you're getting your wings. So I had to get out of Maine, and also had a couple years left on my flying commitment. So I was able to get to Robins Air Force Base, Georgia, which is just like outside of Macon, Warner Robins, Georgia. And I spent 2 years there, basically doing the same job. In the meantime, I had upgraded to an instructor. So, I was the guy sometimes looking over the shoulder of the navigator during a flight, instructing.
Did you do one-on-ones?
Teaching a class on the ground.
Did you do one-on-ones?
But the goal at that was, what's that?
Did you do one-on-one instructions?
In flight, I did.
You did.
Or,
Okay.
you might be tasked to teach a class on ground, with a bunch of the other navigators. But
so now you were doing what they were doing with you,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much the career path. Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
So, this sounds funny, but we had decided to go back to Maine, but southern Maine, right down on the very southern, beautiful coast of Maine. There.
Where's that? Which one?
The little town was Sabattis, outside of Lewiston area, if you know that area. Brunswick, Maine, near LL Bean.
Oh, okay. You're a little bit. I've spent quite a bit, some summers in Algonquin.
Oh, okay. Yeah, not that far south.
Right. Okay.
But that area. Thought I'd be able to get a job, but the good thing was, and I had always had this in the back of my mind, down in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, just south of there, there was Pease Air Force Base, which not only was an active duty base with tankers, but they also had the New Hampshire Air National Guard there, which was like, kind of like the Diamond Guard unit people wanted to get into. It was just, it was right there in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the coast. It was an hour north of Boston, and the unit itself had an excellent reputation. And I was finishing up a master's program that the Air Force used to sponsor master's programs from University of Southern California. And I was finishing up this master's program that I had started at Loring at Pease Air Force Base. And by word of mouth, I heard that the New Hampshire Air National Guard was hiring tanker navigators, 2 of them. And I applied, and it was just like applying for a regular job. You had to supply a resume, you know, went before a panel for interviews. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the 2 navigators hired for what was then a part-time position. Now, I know you know something about the National Guard. The Air National Guard, if you're on flying status, it's a bit different. It's more than 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year, because you have to maintain the same flying standards as your active duty counterparts, basically, because you're flying the same aircraft. So there was an opportunity to be since I couldn't find any other work at the time, to be what's called a guard bum, which basically you could freelance a pretty decent living out of being a freelance navigator or pilot, or the enlisted guy in the back, boom operator, in the Guard, because they just had enough taskings to keep you busy. And I should say, in Loring and Robinson here at the time, it was a tanker. Tankers were in what was called the Strategic Air Command, which was the nuclear force of the Air Force. The tankers belonged to it. We didn't have nukes, but you know, the B-52s and the other type bombers did. And so the Air National Guard was doing the same thing. You could pull this SAC alert, we used to call it, you know, where you actually had to stay in a bunker and wait for World War III to start. And, you know, 24 hours, you'd get 3 days pay for doing that. And so I was able to do that for a year, but even that was something of a struggle. So actually the other navigator who got hired with me that day in 1982 it was, he worked for one of the many big and growing computer companies down in the Boston area, Digital Equipment Corporation. And he says, hey, I'm getting a promotion going to another part of the company. The boss asked him, you know, if he knew anybody that could take your place, and he recommended me, and I got hired. I mean, I really knew nothing, nothing about it, but the boss happened to be an Air Force veteran, and he was looking for, you know, the work ethic that he was used to and appreciated. And so for 5 years, I was both flying for the Air National Guard and working at this computer company in various positions as a marketing writer, or I went into sales training and was developing courses, that sort of thing. And at the same time, you know, 1 day a week on average, I'd leave early on a Thursday or something like that, fly back to the base, my Air National Guard base there in Portsmouth, and fly in the evening and be back at the office on Friday morning.
If I could make an observation here, Ray, you
Yeah.
really have evolved during that period of time into a real Renaissance man, because you started out with your social studies, social sciences, right? Then you become a navigator, which is totally out of your comfort zone at the time in terms of learning, right?
Yeah.
You do that for a while, then you become an instructor, you fly on tankers, and then you become, correct me if I'm wrong, you're part-time in the National Guard?
I was part-time at that time, and I went back to the minimum requirements to remain in the Guard when I got the computer company job. But I would say less a Renaissance man than struggling to make a living, because I had a wife and 2 stepchildren and a house to pay for, you know?
Whatever it takes to motivate one, right?
Yeah.
In the meantime, you picked up an MS in systems management.
Yeah.
There's an academic career that was totally out of your initial comfort zone, right? And then you end up working for DEC.
Yes. Oh, you know the acronym DEC. What's that?
And what you said you were in marketing and sales at the time?
I did not work in sales. However, since I had an education background, I was able to get a position where I actually design some of the courses for the sales reps going through the sales training programs that they had. So,
Right.
I was doing curriculum and instructional design, that sort of thing.
I'm sure you have reflected on this, how this all came about in your life. Some of it was luck, but most of it was willing to take a risk too.
Well, yeah, I mean, it
And
sounds
being
very honorable to
motivated
say that, but
well, and then being motivated that you had to make a living too. I understand that.
yeah, I mean, to me, it was like I should have thought about something better instead. A lot of this was survival. But
yeah, something like a more structured career path, you're saying, right? But,
yeah, I'm the type of person that needs somebody to tell me what to do, basically. So.
It seems to turn out very well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got back to this now. We got you back to working in Boston. Was that a full-time job or part-time? That was full-time.
The computer company job was full-time, and I went to doing the very minimum requirements required for me to remain in the Guard at that point, which was still flying on average 4 times a month.
Right, which kept your status.
Which kept my status, but I cut back on the alert tours and all the discretionary flying I was doing.
So when you accepted the position at the New Hampshire National Guard,
yeah,
that meant you were no longer obviously regular Air Force, correct?
At that time, no. This was a weird thing back in the Cold War, because we flew tankers and we would actually pull SAC alert for the Air Force. So on those 2 or 3 days, every once in a while, and I'd do that, I was actually on federal active duty for like 2 days at a time or 3 days at a time. But to answer the larger question, no, I was a reservist, essentially.
Right, right. Oh, by the way, there is one thing I forgot when I was trying to summarize your career path.
Yeah.
You also were in broadcasting.
Well, that was in my youth.
Yes, yes.
That was a career path not taken. Yeah.
Right.
But so I should say, and I forget the list I gave you there, around 1987, it became more and more challenging for me to be both a full-time employee at a computer company that was asking more of me and to remain in the Guard, and I had to make a decision. Well, the Guard was going to be hiring 3 full-time navigators in this other quasi. I would be full-time active duty, but for the state of New Hampshire. And I got the green ID card like people in the regular Air Force got. And so in 1987, I left digital, or technically took a leave of absence in case I wanted to come back, and went full-time with the New Hampshire Air National Guard.
Can I ask, where were you living this time? Because were you commuting an hour and a half every day into Boston?
No, the digital had so many branches. I was living right on the New Hampshire state line over outside of west of Boston, and the couple of branches I worked with were nearby, but it still took me like an hour to get to the base once a week.
Oh, okay. So now you're back full-time with you're full-time now with the National Guard.
Yeah, in 1987.
Okay.
That was a great job. They put me as one of the planners. 1990 comes along and Desert Storm starts. And they wound up activating my Guard unit, because of the war. I, by that time, was a major. I had been one of the few people they put through this computer flight planning course. So they were sending tankers over to Saudi Arabia. We were rotating them in and out, all these Guard units, but they kept me behind to do planning there in New Hampshire during all that period. See if I don't get ahead of myself here. I eventually, the gate was still open for where we're still with formal hostilities with Iraq. But I eventually went over there after the hostilities on a very odd trip where we were like hosted by the Emir of Kuwait. I didn't meet him, but I met his brother, the foreign minister, and We were being hosted by the Emir of Abu Dhabi of the United Arab Emirates. We were being hosted by the governor of Riyadh, who was one of the 1,000 princes they have over there. It was a very unusual trip, but it was sort of a quasi. We were the crew for this quasi kind of diplomatic thing going on. Yeah.
Okay. I may be jumping ahead here, but I want to ask this question to make sure I get it in.
Yeah.
You had been a navigator. You were a navigator,
Yes.
correct? And you talked about GPS. During your
Yes.
period of time, there was no GPS,
Yes.
but gradually there was. Were you in service at the time when GPS became available?
I was in service, no longer flying, however, and when they started putting them in the tankers.
Okay.
The tankers have since, like most other aircraft in the Air Force, except for very specialized mission type things, the navigators are no more. We're like the firemen on a locomotive. They still have the wings, but now they call them combat system officers, and they do things with computers inside aircraft that have nothing to do with navigation. So, yeah.
But who handles the GPS? Someone has to deal
One
with
of the
that.
two, the pilots do.
Is that right? That's how that.
Yeah, I mean, they went from what we used to call the old analog instrument panels, with all the dials and everything.
Right.
We went from that, and now they have what's called a glass cockpit, which everything looks like a touchscreen computer panel, in front of the yokes in the pilot seats. So yeah, it's a whole different era, navigators are no more for the most part.
So it's just like me talking to my kids about the rotary telephone. If you would talk to some of these young guys now about how you used to do it, it'd be the same thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Interesting. So, okay, now Desert Storm, and you said you basically spent most of your time planning in New Hampshire, but you did go to Iraq after the war, spend time there.
Yeah.
How long were you there?
Oh, it was just like 10 days or something.
10 days you were.
And
Yeah.
I was actually in Kuwait, but we went up to the UN site one day, right on the border there, south of Basra in Iraq. And one of the guards said, that stripe on the parking lot over there, that's Iraq. And I said, can I walk over there? He goes, yeah. So I walked over there. I was in Iraq. I turned around and came back. So
You didn't even say you were there.
yeah. But
did you have any observations of I know it was only 10 days, but while you were there?
Yeah. Up to that point, it was the most fascinating trip I had taken at the time with the Air Force. I'd taken previous trip or the Guard. I'd taken previous trips to places like Australia or Japan, Germany, but to be in such a profoundly different culture, I found quite interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Any observations?
At the time, of course, we were hosts of the government of these places. I was quite impressed. We stayed in this hotel in Kuwait City, and they were still replacing the glass panels that had been bombed out by the Iraqis while we were there, and yet they had this huge Ramadan dinner going downstairs. This wonderful big spread of food that we could eat. So there was that. There's obviously. They had such different standards. For instance, a lot of the people who either live in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, or perhaps UAE, I don't know, if they're nationals of that country, they don't necessarily work. They have foreign workers come in that do the work because they don't need to work. I found that fascinating. I found it fascinating that we were being hosted one evening by this young prince in Saudi Arabia. Like I say, there's like 2,000 princes there or something like that. But he had been a grad student at Tufts University in Boston. They have a School of Law and Diplomacy there. And we were invited into their home in Riyadh with his wife. And as soon as we went into their home, she was out of her abaya, her black outfit, had this, of course, this very expensive clothing on underneath, But as soon as you're in that house, you didn't have to wear that thing. They both spoke impeccable English, as that they'd been born and raised in the States. And yet, as soon as you went back out and went back to your hotel or something, you know, it's like flipping realities.
Interesting. So parallel universes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Interesting. How'd you feel about that?
At the time, I was just sort of taking it all in. I remember one instance in that this guy's father, who was the governor of Riyadh, we had a Ramadan dinner at his house, his palace or whatever it was in the middle of Riyadh. And when we left to go out to our bus back to the hotel, or, you know, private bus we had, there were these women in their abayas, like just squatting by the front gate, talking to each other. And we were told that their husbands were inside with the governor of Riyadh, who was arbitrating a dispute. And this guy held court like one night a week. And they didn't have jury trials. They didn't have litigation. You know, this guy would listen to both sides of the story and make a decision. And it was binding, because this was not a democracy we're talking about. And again, the women outside were there waiting. Those were the wives of these guys. So you're seeing, in some senses, places like that look like the future, you know, the 21st century before it was, or the 22nd century, because of how modern things are. And on the other hand, you're seeing that going on at the same time. So it was just a fascinating experience.
How did they reconcile that? It's got to be a source of tension.
Well, I think it is because the upper classes pretty much either get educated in the United States or they get educated in the United Kingdom, in your graduate degrees. So they are seeing things that are Western. However, I think what they would tell you is you're failing to see our culture. You know, the fact that you ask a question like that shows you don't understand. Now, I'm not defending that, but I've heard explanations such as that.
Sure, sure.
I mean, one of the hosts that we had dinner with, like I said, he and his young wife, who took off her abaya as soon as she got inside, they had been paired from the time they were 3 years old that they were going to get married by their parents. You know,
Right.
And that still happens there. Yeah.
And as Americans, we wonder how you can reconcile those extreme differences
Correct.
and still have a society and a culture. But to them, that is their society and culture.
That is the
and we
norm.
don't understand. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not defending it. I'm just trying to explain that. You know?
Right. Just the way it is. So let's see here now. You were in New Hampshire. I guess I got you through Desert Storm. You're back home safely. And then what happened?
Through circumstances of events, there was an opportunity to go down to work for the National Guard Bureau, first at Andrews Air Force Base, and then eventually at the Pentagon. There were a lot of things related to what was going on during Desert Storm and trying to sell a house here and buy a house there and all sorts of things like that up. But the bottom line was I took the job, and officially I was at Andrews Air Force Base. My title was officer in charge of the 24-hour Air Operations Center, which is like a command post where we tracked all the Air National Guard flights going on at any one time in the country. My real job was to start up a program, which was sort of unrelated to that, in which, I'll be sort of vague about from here on out. But it was like I was asked to start this program from scratch and talk about feeling in over your head. Yes, I was. But a year after I was there, I went over to the Pentagon to work in the programmatic side of it. And I wound up having this very unassuming title. It's called a PEM, P-E-M, Program Element Monitor. which is actually, you're a program manager, and I was being asked to basically start up and run this program. I was a special operations program manager. Again, another area I had never worked in before and felt totally in over my head. Yeah.
So we have to be vague about what exactly you were doing, or
Yeah, let's be vague.
if you tell me you're going to have to kill me kind of deal, or what?
No, they'll just send me. I joke about it. The little implant in my head will go off and warn me. But,
Okay. It'll explode.
no, but it was again, it was a pain in the neck to do. I was working with the non-DoD agencies. I was working with my counterparts at the Joint Chiefs of Staff office, working with the Headquarters Special Operations Command, et cetera, which is down here in Tampa. And eventually, my counterpart down there, who was also Air National Guard, he wanted to come back to Maryland, where he was from, where he and his wife were from. And I really didn't want to be in the DC area. It was hard on my wife. And you know, she wanted to go back to Florida. And
where did you live in DC?
oh boy, we lived outside DC and the outer suburbs towards Annapolis. Yeah.
So I was taking
the subway in every day, and it was just a grueling job. Absolutely. And so this guy and I were allowed to swap jobs, and I went down to MacDill in Tampa for 5 years with this same program. And again, it was program management, you know, funding, taking care of the funding issues for the air crews and airplanes, and while at the same time, you know, helping direct operations when they happened. It was basically a burnout job that I had. If you combine those two places, a burnout job for 7 years.
Okay. Yeah. So from there, MacDill, you retired from the Air Force. Is that correct?
I retired the first time because I'm a glutton for punishment. Yes. I was able to get a full 20-year active duty retirement, even though I was technically in the Air National Guard all that time. It was on federal active duty. They have all these, there's categories you've never heard of.
I'm sure.
But, yeah. I was able to get a good 20-year retirement. It actually took me 25 years to do it because of my part-time status at times. In November of 1999, and I officially retired from the Air National Guard technically, but with a full Air Force retirement.
And what was your rank?
Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel. And you retired as a Lieutenant Colonel?
Yes. So I was retired for 2 years. If you had another question there, don't let me get ahead of you.
No, go ahead.
In January 2001, we've been retired for 2 years, still living in actually St. Pete, because I've been working in MacDill there for 7 years. And I got this letter from the Air Force in the mail that said, we're looking for, you know, like, I think it was 208 or some weird number like that, former pilots and or navigators to come in out of retirement for 2 years. Because they had a shortage. It was one of these booms. The airlines industry goes through hiring booms and then hiring droughts, and they were losing a lot of pilots to the airlines at this time. Like I say, happened cyclically, and so they were starting to put more senior officers in the Air Force back into the cockpit, as we say, to be actually just, you know, pilots on crews. They're putting, you know, like majors and lieutenant colonels back in there as full-time crew members, which left vacancies at headquarters level assignments. So they were looking for pilots and navigators who had been retired less than 5 years, which means also you still have your security clearance, to fill these headquarters positions. I did the math. And because there had been this recent like big jump pay raise throughout the military, which they do every once in a while, 10, 15 years, they'll do not just a cost of living adjustment, but a whole new pay scale. I did the math, and I said to my wife, I said, you know, this would mean $1,000 more a month in my retirement pension if I did this for 2 years. And, you know, we talked about it. We had just bought a retirement place up in North Carolina, out in the woods somewhere. Kind of is on a spontaneous lark, but we were still in St. Pete. And I went ahead and applied for it. And I was accepted, but it took so long. It was taking so long to have them actually take action to do this. First of all, I could pick my own assignment of the ones they had listed. And all the years I had been in the Air Force or Air National Guard, I had been overseas a lot, but never on a full-time assignment tour. And one of the assignments was in Germany, my heritage, you know. And I said, wow, I could be in Germany for 2 years. And so they accepted me to go to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the biggest air base, I think, outside the US that we have. And the paperwork kept dragging their feet. And this is a true, very odd story. But they finally said, okay, you're accepted. Here's your paperwork. Just fax it back to us. Well, we were up in North Carolina. We had to go to town to this little, you know, mail drop store to use their fax machine. And I was literally faxing in my acceptance for this assignment to Germany when we heard on the radio about the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. This was September 11th, 2001. Literally feeding the paperwork through the fax machine. And went home. It was a horrific day, not only for all of us, but I found out that first airplane to hit the World Trade Center, I knew the pilot. I'd met him once, but his brother was one of my colleagues at the New Hampshire Air National Guard. We were best of friends. We were office mates. And this pilot that was the American Airlines pilot was also a reserve pilot, who C-141s. Like I say, I met him once. Nicest family you'd ever want to know. And it was just such a bizarre day that we had that. So I did not return to active duty as a result of 9/11. However, it's just a very odd coincidence. I accepted my position at that very moment to return.
And obviously, certainly, you'll never forget the date that you submitted your paperwork.
Yes.
I mean, of course, you'll never forget 9/11, but all the circumstances around that.
Yes. And my friend who lost his brother that day, I was able to do an oral history with him last year. And so one of our oral histories has him describing that, how he found out that day what had happened. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I went to Germany. My wife and I decided she would stay at the new place back in North Carolina. I would go over there. We would visit back and forth when we could. The reality was, and I say this very respectfully, that we were sort of doing a slow dance towards going our separate ways, and we eventually did, but on a very positive way, really, for both of us, if that sounds strange. But I went to Ramstein Air Base for 2 years. And again, it was being thrown into this cauldron of just burnout type work for 2 years. The title was Senior Director of the Air Mobility Operations Control Center, which sounds like a big title. We had a bunch of senior directors who did rotating 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But when I was off shift, I was taking German classes. I was going to these little towns where nobody spoke English. I was trying out my German, that sort of thing. And I found out that when my 2-year tour was over, I got a surprise in the mail one day back here in the States from the VA that said, oh, because of your recent service, we have reactivated your GI Bill Vietnam era, which was a really good deal at the time. They've since had a new one I'm not eligible for, but in between they had kind of a watered down GI Bill for quite a few years. But mine was the good deal. It was like $1,200-1,300 a month. And I was missing Germany so much, I decided to see what graduate programs they had at German universities, A, that they were taught in English, and B, that was some aspect of the humanities, such as, history or whatever. And the University of Heidelberg, which was just about an hour and a half from where I'd been living in Germany, had just started a Center for American Studies, an interdisciplinary program for international students, all taught in English, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, to anything involved in American studies. I applied and I got accepted. And I went back in the fall of 2005 after being back here in the States for a while.
So you were studying, did I get this right, American Studies?
Yeah, that's a big broad brush term. They had like about 6 traditional subject areas, and you taught, it sounds like I had 3 majors. I didn't have 3 majors, but they call it that. You took 3 areas of concentration as your major areas, and you took 3 areas as minor areas of concentration. So they had like 6 broad areas, and they were taught either by their own faculty members or usually faculty members from these other departments at the university. Yeah.
Okay, and you said they were taught in English?
Yes.
Yes.
One thing about Germany, I think a lot of overseas places, a lot of graduate programs by default are in English because they are looking for an international crowd, and that's the lingua franca. And yeah, so, but this particular one was because it was American studies. So, we took American literature, we took American history, we took a political science course that was like special interest groups and, political economy, that type of thing.
Well, you were really in your element. I mean, you had to be loving this. You were studying American history and you were in Germany.
I have to say this without trying to sound too profound, but 2 of the most profound decisions in my life was A, to go into the Air Force in the first place, because that was transformative for me. But to go to university in Heidelberg and to be surrounded by this international crowd of faculty and scholars. A lot of my fellow students, they were from the former Soviet Union. They grew up in these, or Eastern European countries. They were from Belarus, they were from Romania, they were from Ukraine, they were from Kyrgyzstan. And I was surrounded by these people, and I was in heaven. Just to have that experience. I was one of the only, I think, 3 Americans we had in the program.
You had to be very popular. Not that you wouldn't have been.
I wound up editing and proofing a lot of academic papers because they were all writing as English as their second language.
Okay.
But no, in all seriousness, it was a golden era for me personally. Yes.
Right. So that was 1 year?
That was 1 year. I came back for a year, and they had just started a PhD program. And so I went back in the fall of 2007 and started that. My major area at that point was history. I still have an unfinished dissertation sitting around waiting to submit and to defend, which I can still do under the German system. I really need to finish that. I should finish that. But it's,
what was your area, your specialty area within American history?
For the doctorate, it was Florida history.
Okay.
Laugh as you may, but it's at German universities, and actually at a lot of international universities, a lot of scholars would refer to themselves as Americanists. That's their specialty. Just like we would have somebody at the University of Florida specializing in, French Renaissance history, they have Americanists. And most of them have gotten at least part of their graduate education in the United States, although they're German. My particular advisor had his first book published by the University Press of Florida, as did one other person over there. So one of the things I like about graduate academia is you have all these networks and contacts. They're worldwide.
Sure. So needless to say, you made a lot of contacts, you made a lot of friends. Are you still in contact with, for instance, the friends you made from like Belarus and the former?
Yeah, most of those places, yes. it has been, again, a great experience for me because, first of all, since I'm retired in the military, I can do, up until the pandemic, I could fly what's called space available on Air Force cargo planes or charter aircraft to go places, and it wouldn't cost me anything.
Right.
So my trips to Germany twice a year up until this past fall were usually on a C-17 out of Charleston or someplace. And I'd get over to Germany for free. I've gone all the way to Korea for free like that. Again, that's suspended indefinitely until we have a solution for COVID. But I guess the bottom line, what you're asking, a lot of these fellow students, again, brilliant scholars from these other countries, but English is their second language. Some of them write flawlessly academic English. Some of them are brilliant in what they're trying to say, but will write in German syntax or something.
Right.
And so I've been proofing and editing academic papers from these people for over 10 years now, and the result is I frequently get invited to places that I go to, because they always say, well, how can I pay you for this? And I said, well, invite me to your home country and show me around. And I've taken them up on that.
Mm-hmm. Where have you been?
Directly related to that, I have been to China twice, Hong Kong twice, and Taiwan twice, that cluster there, plus Japan and just passing through Japan, but Korea along the way. I've been to Mexico. I've been to Poland. All told, not all because of this, but I try to make my list. There's 35 plus countries I've been to, either in the military or as a result of traveling since then.
Sure.
And I get shown around by these people. I'm not a tourist. I'm a guest being shown around. It's wonderful.
That's a lot different, isn't it? That's you really see the country, understand it better.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, the travel's been somewhat limited lately.
Yeah, like I say, the last time I was able to go anywhere was Germany this past fall, which is like, I try to go over there twice a year anyway. And, who knows when it will be again, if ever,
Right.
at least for a while. But I know they want to get this space available travel back as soon as we have vaccines, and the country you want to go to is comfortable with letting Americans come in.
That's right.
I'd hope it happens again before I get too old.
Well, let's hope so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think we've more or less wrapped up. This was the focus of the interview, your military career. Is there anything you would like to add concerning the military aspect?
I've sort of said it along the way, but for the best part of my career, I was at first pleasantly surprised, because this was back in the 70s when there was a lot of politics going on then, at just how smart people were that I came across, and just how just made good friends that you weren't expecting. I was, like I say, don't expect to to see the gung-ho stuff you see in the movies. If you're in the Air Force, and especially in the Air National Guard. I mean, the guys I was flying with in the Air National Guard, we had airline pilots, we had their day jobs, we had stockbrokers, optometrists, lawyers. Those were their day jobs, and they had local lives. But then one night a week we'd come in and fly together. It's just the camaraderie of going through an experience like that. I can't explain it. It was just great.
Right.
I'm still in touch with many of those people. So yeah, again, overall, whether it was basic training, officer school training, navigator training, the units I was in, I worked with a heck of a lot of good people. There's always a bad apple in the bunch in any job, but they were quite minimal, actually, in my experience. The toughest jobs I had, the saving grace, was you worked with good people, and you worked with teamwork, and that kept you sane. And humor cannot be underestimated as working in an environment like that. in the worst of times, you're just cracking jokes back and forth all the time, because otherwise you go nuts.
Well, you have to cope. It's a coping mechanism,
Yes,
certainly,
yes.
yes.
So I appreciate that. I know we live in different times now. I think it would be hard, if not impossible, to have a draft again, which I'm not suggesting we do, but I think we live in such a different culture now, where we're trying to get people to wear face masks, I think one of the questions I ask from time to time is, what would you tell young people today? And
Right.
I don't want to sound patronizing, but and I see a lot of young people doing this, especially when it comes to certain issues that they were passionate about. But you just can't underestimate teamwork and selflessness in something that you believe in.
Well, Ray, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your military career, I know you were a bit, well, you've always been humble about it, but I know we talked about doing this interview. You were like, I don't know if I really would like to do that because I didn't have combat experience as an example, but
Yeah.
that has nothing to do with it. It's just, it's amazing your experiences and your decisions that you made along the way.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much.
And I appreciate it. And I suppose we could stop this. I think when we stop the recording, we will still be on together.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let's see what happens.
Yeah.